know, the story of American democracy has been a hard but inexorable march towards greater equality. Equality regardless of race, equality regardless of social status, equality regardless of marital status, and equality regardless of sex. That march began at the founding of our country, when Abigail Adams reminded her husband to, quote, remember the ladies when drafting the Constitution, which fell, unfortunately, on deaf ears. It was a march that grew great numbers during the convention at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, and found expression in the abolitionist movement. That march took a bold step 100 years ago when Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman drafted the original iteration of the Equal Rights Amendment and came before Congress for the first time. Let that great march towards equality take the next bold step today when the Senate votes to take up this bipartisan resolution on the ERA. This resolution is as necessary as it is timely. America can never hope to be a land of freedom and opportunity so long as half its population is treated like second-class citizens. So 100 years after the ERA first came to Congress, the work is not done. The fight is yet to be won. The march continues, and we have a chance to take this next step forward. The resolution is simple. It removes the arbitrary deadline for state ratification of the ERA that was imposed in the 1970s. Today, 38 states have ratified the ERA as required by the Constitution. But because 2 states acted only recently after the deadline set by Congress, the ERA remains unratified. Today's resolution says this deadline shall be in effect no more, and by doing so recognizes that a sufficient number of states have now acted for the ERA to become the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. There is no good reason, none, for this chamber, this Congress, and this nation to bind itself to limitations set 50 years ago. The Constitution itself imposes no such barrier. The Constitution itself imposes no such barrier. By keeping this barrier in place, this 7-year barrier, all we're doing is needlessly obeying skewed rules set by politicians who are long gone and whose views ought not to rule the day any longer. In 2023, we should move forward to ratify the ERA with all due haste, because if you look at the terrible things happening to women's rights in this country, it's clear we must act. To the horror of hundreds of millions of American people, women in America have far fewer rights today than they did even a year ago. The protections of Roe v. Wade are gone thanks to the MAGA majority on the Supreme Court. Over a dozen states have near total abortion bans, and millions of people have to travel hundreds of miles just to access reproductive care. That's sickening. That's why the Senate today should vote in favor of advancing this ERA resolution so we can bring our nation one step closer to greater justice, greater equality, and a more perfect union. Again, let that great march towards equality take the next bold step today. And I thank Senators Cardin and Murkowski as our lead sponsors. It's a bipartisan bill, and all members who've championed this resolution. And I will proudly vote yes on this measure. Now on default. Yesterday, House Republicans passed, through the narrowest possible margin, a bill that amounts to a little more than a hard-right ransom note to the American people. Republicans' Default on America Act, DOA, cannot possibly be called a real plan for resolving the default crisis. The DOA reads more like a threat coming directly from the House Freedom Caucus. Either Republicans will force a default on the debt, or they will force steep cuts, highly unpopular with the American people, for law enforcement, veterans, families, teachers, kids. Let's be perfectly clear. The Republican Default on America Act does nothing to actually resolve the looming debt crisis, and it has no hope of ever becoming law. If anything, the House's actions have made the likelihood of default more likely. It locks the House into an unacceptable position and pulls us even further apart. And this shows the real solution is a clean, bipartisan plan to avoid default. It's the same one both parties have adopted many times before. That is the solution, not this Default on America Act that's going nowhere. If Republicans want to sell this terrible agenda to the American people, they should make their case in talks about the budget and appropriations, where it belongs, not by using the full faith and credit of the United States as a hostage. So let me say that again. The Republican Default on America Act does nothing to resolve the default crisis and, in fact, makes it only more likely. The Default on America Act, which the House just passed, is not a step forwards, but rather a costly step backwards. Speaker McCarthy has claimed for months he wants to negotiate on avoiding default. But according to reports, he's saying the opposite behind closed doors. Per at least one GOP House member, Speaker McCarthy called this radical bill a floor, not a ceiling. That's what he told the hard-right members whose votes he needed. The Speaker has reportedly promised his right flank that moving forward he will oppose any measure that doesn't have every single hard-right priority considered in this bill. In other words, to say this bill is a floor, not a ceiling, is a threat to make the GOP bill even more extreme and avoid any alternative. If these reports are true, then Speaker McCarthy has made clear he has no intention of negotiating. The Speaker can't say his bill is a floor, not a ceiling, and also claim he wants to negotiate. This is rather a hostage-taking tactic, and this Default on America Act is the ransom note forced on us by a hard-right, unrepresentative small group in the House of Representatives who had leverage because of the rules there. The GOP should realize that the American people will reject steep cuts to education, law enforcement, veterans care, and border security that the DOA bill proposes. So for all the effort the GOP spent trying to pass their bill, unfortunately, we are not any further along to resolving the debt ceiling crisis, and if anything, we have taken a costly step backward. It all brings us back to the place where we have been since the very beginning. The only real solution to avoiding a catastrophic default is the same solution that both parties have adopted in the past. Come together for a clean plan to avoid default, with no ransom notes, no floors, no brinksmanship. Democrats will not allow this Default on America Act to become law. And finally, on safe banking. Yesterday, senators from both sides of the aisle, I've met with them repeatedly, reintroduced the Safe Banking Act. Safe banking would ensure cannabis businesses that operate in states with legal cannabis have equal access to critical banking infrastructure. Clearly, this bill has provisions particularly aimed at helping minority business owners who are at a critical disadvantage in the cannabis industry. Right now, the norm for the cannabis businesses is to operate on all cash, and that's simply not fair. It exposes them to too many risks and stifles their opportunities to grow. Congress should be in the business of promoting entrepreneurs, promoting job growth, not holding these things back. I've worked very hard to make progress in safe banking, plus, and the work will continue. But I've also made it clear that one of my top priorities to ensure safe banking passes is that it contain critical criminal justice provisions, most importantly, expunging criminal records for certain low-level marijuana offenses. We have a moral responsibility in Congress to undo the terrible damage caused by the war on drugs, and almost always has affected people of color. So I'm going to work very hard with my colleagues to make sure criminal justice provisions are part of safe banking when it reaches the floor. I thank all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. We've met on numerous times, and I think everyone's working in good faith, including Senators Merkley, Daines, Brown, Sullivan, Paul, a bipartisan group if there ever was one. I look forward to working with my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, to make progress on Safe Banking Plus this Congress, and I hope this portends more bipartisan cooperation on future cannabis legislation. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we'll shortly be voting on the cloture motion for SJ Res 4, and we are joined by Senator Murkowski. I first want to start by thanking her for her extraordinary leadership on this issue and so many other issues that involve equality and opportunity for all Americans. It's been a journey that we have shared together, and I really want to thank her for her leadership on SJ Res 4. It's bipartisan, and I know we're going to have a strong vote. I would just urge our colleagues not to filibuster equality. Let's get onto this resolution and complete the work that we've done. The states have already completed the work. 3/4, 38 states have already approved, ratified the constitutional amendment for equal rights. It's now necessary for us to take the final step to remove any doubt on the validity of the actions, the previous actions of Congress and the ratifications by the states. The courts have held, and we've done before. It's up to Congress to do this. We have the authority, and we have the opportunity today by the vote that's going to take place. I do want to we just heard, got a statement of the administration's policy. President Biden strongly supports SJ Res 4. So we now have the support of the executive branch, and I hope that we can get the votes today in order to move forward on this. It's necessary. We know that there's still systemic challenges based upon sex in our workplace, in health care, in domestic violence. This will be helpful. Most Americans already think it's part of the Constitution. So let's get the job done. We'll have an opportunity to do so in a few moments. And again, I want to thank my colleague who has been a true leader on this, Senator Murkowski from Alaska. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator for Alaska.
Mr. President, I thank Senator Cardin. I thank him for his leadership on this issue, not only in this Congress, but in the previous Congresses, when we have attempted to advance this very important measure. What we have in front of us right now is Senate Joint Resolution 4, an amendment to add the Equal Rights Amendment to our Constitution. It's pretty simple, Mr. President. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It is as simple as that. That's it. That's the full substance of the Equal Rights Amendment. We refer to it as the ERA. I think most people in this country believe that it's already a part of the Constitution, that it's already a protection under it. Justice Scalia stated more than a decade ago now, he said, "Certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't." A little bit of the history here. The ERA was first proposed back in 1923, 3 years after ratification of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote, fully 100 years removed from where we are today. Now, 50 years later, the ERA finally passed Congress, was signed by President Carter in 1972. There was a 7-year deadline for ratification. 35 states moved quickly, including the state of Alaska, within that deadline. It was extended once in 1982 to give the remaining states some more time to consider it, but momentum waned as other things took precedent. The ERA didn't go away, though. Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia became the 36th, the 37th, and the 38th states to ratify it between 2017 and 2020. And so where we are today is there are 38 states that have ratified the ERA. That meets the threshold of the 3/4 of the states that are needed to ratify a constitutional amendment. But that can't happen because of a technicality, because the preamble of the ERA contains an outdated deadline for ratification. And that's where our simple resolution comes in. It removes that arbitrary deadline to reflect what has actually happened instead of what Congress thought was going to happen some decades ago. It would affirm the Equal Rights Amendment has been ratified by 38 states, met the threshold to be made part of the Constitution, and allow that to finally occur. Now, some have suggested that the ERA is no longer needed. We've certainly made great strides as women since 1923, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. Women are a majority of the U.S. population, but continue to be underrepresented in elected office, in the courts, in the business world, and in so many other areas. There remains, of course, a pay gap. We know of this. We hear the statistics all the time. Pay gap between men and women, 18 cents on the dollar, according to the GAO, and that gap is wider across industries and within certain groups, to 22 cents on the dollar for women at private, for nonprofit, or for-profit companies, and 23 cents for full-time managers. As Senator from Maryland has mentioned, ERA is also needed to help address violence against women. Statistics from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, for example, show that 1 in 7 women, compared to 1 in 25 men, have been injured by an intimate partner. Again, what the Equal Rights Amendment provides, it would establish fundamental protections against discrimination based on sex. Every one of us should agree that such discrimination is completely unacceptable, and that every citizen, regardless of sex, should enjoy the same rights under our Constitution. And that's all we're doing here today. Again, it's equality of rights under the law should not be denied on account of sex. It shouldn't be controversial, but just about everything nowadays it somehow is. There's been debate about whether Congress has the authority to act on this resolution. I believe we do. There is no constitutional provision, there's no law, no Supreme Court decision telling us that we can't. The Constitution contains no time limit for ratification of amendments, and there is clear precedent for states taking years, decades, even centuries to do so. The 27th Congressional Pay Act Amendment was ratified in 1992. That was a full 203 years after it was enacted in 1789. Another issue that's been raised is the 5 states that have attempted to rescind their ratification. But the Constitution does not contemplate rescissions, and there's clear precedent for Congress determining that rescinding an amendment after ratification is ineffectual. In 1868, Congress adopted a concurrent resolution declaring that the 14th Amendment had been ratified, despite the fact that 2 states, New Jersey and Ohio, had attempted to rescind their prior ratifications. Again, the purpose of the ERA is to secure full equality for women, and there should be no time limit on that. Men and women should be treated equally under the law, and that's not a controversial position. It's a widely held view. The fact of the matter is, the vast majority of Americans support the ERA. 73% according to one poll from 2020, 78% according to another, and 85% according to a poll from last year, including 93% of Democrats, 93% of independents, and 79% of Republicans. At least half of the states have constitutions, like Alaska, that guarantee equal rights based on sex in some way. So I am proud, again, that our state stepped up in 1972 and a few months later, by an overwhelming vote, amended our Constitution to prohibit sex discrimination. Mr. President, we're at the point where we're going to take a vote here right now. I'm not entirely pleased by the timing of our debate on this resolution because we have not yet secured the 60 votes needed for its passage. I don't really like it being used as filler on the floor, as somewhat of an exercise that runs clock on a largely empty legislative calendar. I don't see how the ERA or women in this country will ultimately benefit from that. But I am proud to lead this resolution with Senator Cardin. I am proud to be working with him and others that, again, would see through the hollow arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment and would join us in passing it. The American people are waiting for this. It is long overdue for Congress to act. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Once again, I want to thank Senator Murkowski for her leadership. This is a bipartisan effort, this joint resolution that we have, and it's been what the Equal Rights Amendment journey was about. It started with action in the Congress. It was strong bipartisan support for the resolution for equal rights, no discrimination based upon sex in our Constitution. It was passed by the House and Senate by bipartisan majorities. The state's ratification process, I could tell you about the one in Maryland that I was part of when I was in the House of Delegates in our state legislature when we ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. It was strong bipartisan support. And I am proud today that I'm joining with Senator Murkowski for the need for the Equal Rights Amendment to be ratified. So this is a bipartisan effort. I hope our colleagues will not filibuster it. I understand the concern. This will be our first vote in the Senate on the resolution. The House has already passed it in 2 previous Congresses. I know that our House colleagues are watching, and I thank them for their leadership in the House. This will be our first opportunity in the Senate, and I'm glad we're having this opportunity. And with that, Mr. President, I would ask consent that we, despite the previous order, that we can start the vote immediately.
Without objection, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 3, S.J. Res. 4, a joint resolution removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. number 4, joint resolution removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Moran. No. Yeah. Sir. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Yeah. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. No, not yet. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. Thanks. Mrs. Gillibrand. Sir. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Fetterman, Hassan, Kane, King, Murkowski, Ossoff, Reed, Schatz, Shaheen, and Smith. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Crapo, Haggerty, Lankford, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, and Tuberville. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Vance, no. Mr. Schmidt, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye.
Will come to order. The gallery will come to order. The gallery will come to order. The sergeant at arms will remove the individual. The, the individual will leave the chamber. The Sergeant at Arms will remove the individual from the chamber. The Sergeant at Arms will remove the individual from the chamber. The Senate will come to order.
Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Lummis? Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Mullen, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Budd, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Collins, aye.
Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mrs. Britt, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Ricketts, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Mr. Schumer? No.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 47. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader,
I enter a motion to reconsider.
the motion is entered.
And let me explain. I switched my vote to no, not because I'm not strongly for ERA. I wanted to bring it to the floor. But it will allow us to go back and cast a vote again in the future. This issue is too important, and so we're not giving up. So I'm moving to reconsider so I can bring it back up at a later time. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 22, Anthony DeVos Johnstone of Montana, to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Anthony DeVos Johnstone of Montana to be the United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory. Under the rule, the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Cremo, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz.